Thank you all so much for joining us once again for this Georgia climate series with Drawdown Georgia. We are so excited to have Dr. Marshall Shepard with us today. Dr. Marshall Shepard is an internationally recognized climate scientist and weather expert. He's with the University of Georgia. So, Dr. Shepard, thank you so much for joining us once again. And please introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Eriqah. It's really an honor to be here. I am the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Sciences and Geography at the University of Georgia, also a Regents Professor. And we have an Atmospheric Sciences program at the University of Georgia as well. And I serve as the director of that and was a part of the first generation of Drawdown Georgia getting going when Emory, Georgia Tech, and the University of Georgia collaborated through the Ray C. Anderson funding.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have you as someone who is very familiar with Drawdown Georgia and is familiar with the climate work happening in the state and internationally. So let's jump right in. Let's start our conversation by understanding a few basic terms. So if you could tell our audience the difference between climate and weather, I think people get confused there, and the connection between the two as well.
They're definitely connected, but wintertime is when I see people confuse it the most. Sure. We'll see a snowstorm or a cold day, and people will say, "Hey, Dr. Shepard, I got 20 inches of global warming in my yard." And that tells me right away that they don't necessarily understand the difference between the two. So I often say weather is your mood and climate is your personality. And if you think about what I'm saying there, your mood today doesn't necessarily tell me anything about your personality, nor does one day or 1 week of weather define climate or climate change. So weather is sort of the day-to-day realization of the atmosphere and its processes, whereas climate is the overall statistics of the atmosphere in terms of weather. I often hear people refer to climate as average weather. That's part of it, but that's too limiting. It is more than just average. It's the highs and lows, max and mins. It's the distribution of weather in places and over time and so forth. It's ranges, it's extreme frequency and so forth. So it's a broader statistical view of the day-to-day representations, but they're very much connected. So you can think of weather on time scales of, say, 0 to 14 days or so. And then there's something between long-range climate and weather. We call it seasonal to subseasonal variability. So things like El Nino and La Nina that happen on week to monthly time scales.
When I hear personality versus mood, I get that. I also think that, so tell me if I'm right or wrong. So we're looking at, we could be looking at, we've had unseasonably cold and warm times this winter in Georgia, where like we saw like 80-degree days, and then like 3 days later it was 40 degrees. So we're seeing those ranges. But if we're thinking about, we're looking at a week that's unseasonably warm, but overall it may have been a colder winter or a warmer winter. Is that what we're thinking about somewhat when we're thinking about climate?
This actually was the second warmest winter on record in the United States, but on the East Coast it was cold. We had some snowstorms, but if you look out west, they were abnormally warm for much of the winter. And that's related to the jet stream patterns and sort of the superimposition of weather, jet stream highs and lows. So you have winter and you will have cold weather in winter. And that's what we had here in Georgia, but we also had some really warm conditions. And so how those two connect, we know that naturally varying weather happens. You get winter and you'll get days that are cold and are warm. But if you look at some of the days that we had in Georgia, we were in February, we were in the 80s at times. Right. They were early March in places like Arizona. They were 100, 110, 108 degrees. So that's the steroid on top of the naturally varying climate. And so that's one way I also like to talk about this, because people will often say, well, we've always had winter and we've always had heat waves and the climate changes naturally, Dr. Shepard. Don't you know that? And I said, of course I do. I have a PhD in atmospheric sciences. But what we also know is that there is now a steroid on top of these naturally varying processes, such that 80 degrees in February in Georgia tells me that that's probably a climate change signal or amplification on top of the natural cycle. And so I kind of, to give you another analogy, grass grows naturally, but when we fertilize our lawn, it grows differently. So we have to sort of, when we talk to people, and I think you know this, we have to move people from thinking either or. It's either naturally varying or it's human-induced climate change. It's both.
So what impacts, you talked a little bit about it already, but what impacts does a changing climate have on Georgia beyond the changes in just our day-to-day weather?
You know, when I talk about climate change, I also try to move the conversation beyond just temperature. I think that in the same way that a fever is a symptom of the flu or COVID, warming temperatures is just one symptom of climate change. And so in Georgia, we're clearly experiencing elevated temperatures, which are leading to a generation of, particularly in the warm season, extreme temperatures with more temperatures over 90 degrees, over 95 degrees. But what worries me about temperature most actually isn't the extreme daytime temperatures, it's the temperatures at night, because one of the smoking guns for climate change is that the nighttime temperatures are warming. So we don't have as many record low temperatures anymore in Georgia and across the US because the nighttime temperatures are slowly creeping up, and that impacts public health. That's where the health disparities and health outcomes start to be most noticeable, particularly in urban environments where you superimpose that on top of an urban heat island. And now we're seeing those types of things in Georgia. We published some work at the University of Georgia back in 2015 looking at we produced what we think is the first climate vulnerability indices or index for Georgia. And so we know that many of our urbanized counties are experiencing more extreme heat, heavier rainfall, raining with greater intensity, and that leads to flooding because of more water vapor in the atmosphere because it's warmer. So we get heavier rainstorms, we've got impervious surfaces, and we've got stormwater engineering that was designed for last century rainstorms. So that's one way that we're seeing impacts in Georgia. That study also found that we're seeing increased frequency and intensity of drought in our rural counties in the South, where much of our agricultural activity is, Southwest and Southeast Georgia. And so that directly impacts yield of peanuts and pecans and all kinds of things. And then, of course, the thing that's worrying me the most recently, Eriqah, and you will nod your head in agreement, I'm sure, we're getting intense hurricanes well into the state of Georgia now. Think about Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Michael in 2018. No longer do coastal Georgia, like places like Savannah and St. Mary's, have to prepare for hurricanes. We have to prepare for hurricanes in Atlanta and Augusta and Macon. And then, of course, there's sea level rise along the Georgia coast that we're seeing as well, and also impacts on shrimp. There's something called black gill that we saw in recent years that's related to affecting shrimp, and that may be related to warming water. So Georgia, unfortunately, experiences every type of extreme weather. We get it all here, and climate change is amplifying it.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned agriculture. Obviously, Georgia's a big agriculture state, always has been, but also, and I'm sure you'll expound on this, even in the city. I mean, even where we're not growing, but we're seeing pollen increases, or we're seeing bees in February. I think bees were confused, just as confused as us, to see each other in February. But we're not really sure, okay, not only how am I supposed to dress, but the trees are confused about whether or not they're pollinating or not. The pollen count increase, which we know we have a huge, pollen situation in Georgia with, people having so many extreme allergies, and watching that so closely. My daughter has severe seasonal allergies. So I'm thinking about that, not even just for the agriculture folks, but also for the city folks. We're like, what are we supposed to be doing? Not only how are we supposed to be dressing, but are we supposed to be preparing for pollen in February, or do we have a few more months to go before we need to do that?
That's one of the sort of, again, clear examples, I think, for people that wonder, well, is climate really changing? Well, are you sneezing earlier? The pollen is much earlier now, and that's a phenological process that we've, understood for some time, that things are blooming and you're getting pollen occurrence much earlier than we normally do. I was on a study with some colleagues at the University of Georgia a few years ago that showed that migration of birds were coming back too early because of the warming temperatures. And then when we get here, their food supply, the insects that they normally eat, weren't there. So then they were starving. And so there are all of these phenological effects, but we also see that in different ways too. The growing seasons are changing or different in different places, and that has implications. So yeah, there are implications in cities and rural. And then some would argue, well, that maybe that's a benefit. People often make these arguments, well, there are positive outcomes of climate change. And there are a few, but those are far outweighed by the negative outcomes. But one thing that I went to the Georgia Climate Conference down in Jekyll Island a few months ago, And I was in a panel with a woman, who's growing oranges. They have orange groves in South Georgia now.
Okay.
Oranges are typically associated with the sunshine state of Florida. But because the warm envelope is creeping further north, there are parts of Georgia that can support a citrus industry now. But guess what rides that wave of warming temperatures further north? Mosquitoes like carry dengue and other things that used to be further south and in the tropics. So it's a kind of give and take on that.
We're talking about climate change. We're talking about the effects of a warming climate. What do climate change projections look like for Georgia in the coming decades? I know that we always hear 2030 is irreversible. If we get to 2050, it's irreversible, or, these varying degrees. And what is the, to your point about not just looking at the temperature, but also looking at the atmospheric degrees. That's why I think people hear, it's supposed to go up 2 degrees or whatever in the atmosphere. And they're like, well, that's not the temperature that we're feeling every day. It's a different conversation. So what are our projections looking like, and what should we be preparing?
Well, I thank you for picking up on that point, because I don't like to talk about temperature at all, because people don't kind of grasp 2 degrees, 1 degree. And remember, that's in Celsius. That's in Celsius. So it's that when we think in terms of Fahrenheit, those numbers are even higher. But people just don't internalize that. Oh, great, I can just have more cookouts in December. I mean, that's how people think about when they hear. So recently we've done what's called attribution studies, where we connect this warming to things that people do notice, like hurricanes and extreme flooding and drought. Okay. Georgia, as we're recording this in early April, is in the midst of a really bad drought, and it's getting worse. So these are the things that start to impact the price of cereal and the cost of peanut butter. And when people are driving over roadways that are flooded and they can't get home, or when a hurricane is costing $4 to $6 billion in economic damage for the state of Georgia from Helene and others. These are the things that I like to talk about. You hear people talk about 1.5 degree or 2 degrees, the Paris Agreement. This is all climate wonk stuff. People don't really care about that. We know about it, but those things don't resonate with my family in Canton, Georgia. So one of the really nice things about the Drawdown, the climate outlook maps that have been sort of debuted here this month, they have temperature and precipitation outlooks, but they also have things like, growing season, some indications of the frost days and so forth. So they're taking well-known principles that we've used, climate models, and they have sort of looked at these time horizons out, several decades to several hundred years out. And I think that's useful for planning. One of my good conservative colleagues, Congressman Bob Inglis from South Carolina, a former Republican congressman who runs the organization Republic EN. One of the things that he used to always talk about, and he talked about it on my podcast as well, is that we need to plan as policymakers, as businesses, and the public for the range of outcomes. And so climate outlook maps that have been produced by Drawdown provide you sort of this range of outcomes based on sort of worst case, the scenarios, the business usual scenarios. And so it can give us some planning horizons.
I'm so glad you said that, because we've talked before on this show about meeting people where they are. And so, I'm glad you said that, because meeting people where they are is so important, and mentioning kind of having conversations with our conservative colleagues and having conversations with our conservative congressmen and congresspeople about what does the range of outcomes look like and what are we preparing for? So maybe we need to have those conversations in a ways of okay, here are the possibilities though. We might have a difference of opinion on whether or not it's happening or what that means for what's happening, but here are a range of possibilities that it can happen. And so how are we preparing, especially as this area of the country that is largely focused when it comes to economics and livelihood on agriculture?
Yeah, I've talked to policymakers from both sides. I think we've moved beyond sort of this idea that it's not happening anymore. And I think that I think there are many people that probably have more conservative principles that very much get it. I think that there are people on the left side that also get it. So the Six America study shows that only about 10% of the American population is dismissive of climate today and climate science. I just think we perceive it to be more because they're the loudest sometimes. Yeah. But, in my experience in testifying before Congress and giving briefings to the Senate, I think that, irrespective, and, I don't really kind of get in the political sides of things. I just kind of tell my what I know as an expert.
Yes.
My sense is that people do get it. I think they're just sort of differing opinions on, as you noted, sort of the pace. And really most of the conversation is centered around the solution space, because that's where the sort of economics and policy comes in. That's why Drawdown was so important. And shout out to the Ray C. Anderson Foundation for kickstarting the Drawdown Georgia effort many years ago. And I was happy to be right there. I was actually involved even before Drawdown and the Georgia Climate Project. There was something called the Climate Dream Team that John Lanier assembled of climate experts, of a handful of climate experts here in the state, and I happen to be one of those. So we kind of saw that what was coming even before some of these programs stood up. And so now we are here. And one of the things that Drawdown Georgia was thinking about was the solution space. We were looking at a 2030 time horizon in phase one. How can we take the drawdown principles and apply them to Georgia? Because, of course, those drawdown principles from Project Drawdown, all of them weren't applicable to the state of Georgia. And so that's really what Drawdown Georgia tried to do. But now we've kind of entered this, second and third generation Drawdown Georgia, where we have greenhouse gas trackers and we have these climate outlook maps now for the state. And so all of these things are what we need to be doing. We've now entered this era, in my view, of moving to discussion of not just solution space, because we know what needs to be done, reducing carbon emissions. In some cases, we're going to have to adapt through adaptation processes, but also resilience. I was just a group in the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems at University of Georgia, which I'm a part of, along with Pew Trust, recently released Georgia's first statewide resiliency plan. And so it's talking about how we can sort of create greater resiliency to these emerging risks that the state face, because we have the Port of Georgia, we have a significant agriculture base, we have major urban centers like Atlanta and Savannah, Macon, Augusta, and Columbus. We have people. Georgia is very unique in that we get all of the extreme weather and climate events, but we also have mountains, we have coastal regimes, we have plain, we have urban areas, and we have a very sort of representative population of all socioeconomic and cultural and racial types and so forth. So we're a cauldron for sort of risk and vulnerability. So we've got to get the discussion moving in a direction of sort of sustainability, risk, and resiliency.
And I'm glad you mentioned resilience. It's a conversation a lot of people are having now, because it's like climate change isn't coming, it's here.
It's here, yeah.
So what are we going to do with what we already know right now?
Yeah.
That we already have going on.
And I would say I co-authored a report for the National Academy of Sciences last year, and we were looking at something called compound disaster. So not only is climate change, that's why I appreciate what you said there, because I don't want this to sound like taken in the wrong way. I think the climate outlook maps are very important for planning horizons, but I worry more about the current horizon, 0 to 10.
Right.
It's here. These things are happening, and they're just going to amplify and accelerate. And so one of the things that we're seeing is compound disasters, and that was what this report was about. This idea that we have a Hurricane Helene, or we have wildfires in California, and they have these compounding and cascading impacts. It's more than just the lost power outages or the barns on the farms blown down, but there are a series of cascading events that can last days to weeks to months that then start to have significant impact socioeconomically. I look at Hurricane Helene and what it did in parts of Augusta, Georgia. They lost trees, significant tree cover. That, by the way, has implications, because that lost tree cover and shading and evapotranspirational cooling will likely mean that they will deal with a greater heat stress from urban heat and urban heat islands and so forth. But they also had significant power disruptions to water and gas leaks and so forth. And so that disrupted a major Georgia city for months. And in some places in Georgia, some farmers probably still haven't recovered completely from the impacts of Hurricane Helene or Hurricane Michael. And then I look at what happened in just Atlanta, I think it was about a year or two ago. I look at the AU complex where Morehouse and Spelman and Clark Atlanta and Morris Brown are. What would have been in past years considered sort of an afternoon summer heavy thunderstorm. It was raining with such great intensity that the dorms flooded, and that disrupted some of those students' educational experience. So these are sort of symptoms that are here and now, not future.
Yes, absolutely. As a Spelman alumna, I remember that very clearly, because we needed to, as the alumni chapter, needed to get in gear to help those students. So we're talking about resilience and mitigation. Like, what are we going to do when it happens again?
And it will. I think that's a key point you're making, Erica. Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Helene, that flood that happened that in fact impacted the Atlanta University complex, the drought that we're experiencing more frequently, these aren't one-offs. We will see another Hurricane Helene. This summer. We probably will see another flood event just like that, because they're happening very frequently now, these intense rainstorms. And so we got to get our head out of the sand and sort of say, okay, let's not react to when they happen. Let's plan ahead. I'm a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, a historically African-American fraternity. Mm-hmm. And when I was pledging way back in the day, because I'm way older than you, I remember the big brothers telling me then, prior planning prevents poor performance. And so we know certain things are going to happen. So are we going to build and design our farm systems or our dorms or our facilities to be more resilient to what's coming? Think about Hurricane Milton that impacted the Tampa Bay region in 2024, the same year that Helene happened. The Tampa Bay Rays baseball team, the Major League Baseball team, their stadium's roof was ripped off. It was shredded by Hurricane Milton. Are they going to design that or build a roofing system for that stadium going forward that can withstand Cat 4 and Cat 5 hurricanes? We know that's one of the things that's going to likely be most sort of evident from climate changes, which is a generation of intense hurricanes. We might not get as many hurricanes in the future, based on what the studies suggest, but when they happen, they're likely to be on average stronger.
So you talked about the maps. Drawdown Georgia has introduced a new resource, a series of climate outlook maps, as you've mentioned, which show what climate impacts could look like across Georgia in 2050, depending on how much we are able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So could you tell us a little about what does make these maps such an important resource for Georgia as we're looking forward?
I think they're really valuable for academics, for policymakers, for businesses, and other stakeholders, because they create a range of scenarios to plan for. The way we run models, or the way climate models are done and climate assessments are done, whether it's the National Climate Assessment or the IPCC, is we try to sort of envision these different scenarios that society plays out in terms of emissions and population and carbon and urban land cover and so forth. And so then we can sort of run our climate models under these different assumptions about what society will look like. And so I think what these climate outlook maps show is that in 2050 Georgia, here's what potential South Georgia precipitation, growing season, and rainfall look like under our worst case scenario, under our business usual scenario, and under a scenario where we take action. And so you can, and again, to harken back to Bob English, you can start to develop a plan of action, a range of scenarios. Any good business practice or any good policymaker is not going to make decisions based on sort of a binary 0-1 or black or white outcome. You need to understand all of the shades of gray between black and white. And so that's what these outlook maps provide. Again, I think they're designed and done in a way by Bill Drummond and his team at Georgia Tech that the average person can consume them. I think they have a very targeted function and are of value. So, I mean, I really salute the team for making something that it is accessible to the attentive public. But I view these maps as far more valuable for sort of planning horizons for companies, state and local government, national government, industry, and so forth, perhaps even our national security infrastructure as well. We have a project at the University of Georgia right now where we're assisting the U.S. Navy with some climate and risk and natural hazard assessment. And we've been using some of the same model output. That they're using something called LOCA, which is sort of a climate model intercomparison projection. It's something called CMIP. We've been using some of that data as well to try to understand some of the resiliency, vulnerability, and risk aspects for some of the sort of facilities here in Georgia.
Wonderful. I think you're right. It probably, like you and I and the folks that are doing the work, are going to want to have these maps. What do you think, or what do you want people to think about when they look at the climate maps? What do you hope that they take from that could be the most valuable as people are planning, especially from a local government perspective, as you mentioned, which I think that is what we really need to think about, is like, how are our local governments preparing for what could happen? So what do you want people to think when they...
Yeah, one thing I want people to take away, and it comes back to this weather versus climate discussion we had earlier, I think our weather models are able to predict 3 days from now where a cold front will be, or whether that hurricane has moved inland.
Right.
Climate projections are a little bit different, so people need to consume them without taking them as absolutes. They do have uncertainty with them,
Sure.
but they're meant to provide sort of a macro level guidance for things like temperature, growing season, and so forth. Whereas our weather models have the fidelity to paint very clear pictures of what the atmosphere looks like in 3 days or in 7 days or 5 days. So what these climate outlook maps have done is they've taken some of these climate projections, and they have some limits on the detail and how and the fidelity and so forth, and sort of projected those onto the state of Georgia under these different risk scenarios or sort of societal scenarios that we talked about. So it's important for people to understand that you need to consume those kind of outlook maps very differently from the way you consume weather models. Interestingly enough, there are sort of a generation of people that have grown up on things like the Farmer's Almanac. Those are essentially outlooks. So people have used outlooks, whether they know it or not, if they've opened up or cracked open a Farmer's Almanac. Now, I'm not, the Farmer's Almanacs themselves have been shown to be less than 40% accurate based on certain studies. But my point is, people are familiar with the concept of outlooks, whether they know it or not. That soon Colorado State and NOAA is going to issue an outlook for what the hurricane season will look like. Those are outlooks. They're not forecasts. They're not predicting exactly what's going to happen. And so in terms of these outlook maps, I think that's one thing that I would want people to take away, is that you consume them as they're meant to be consumed, not with any biases or any wish casting.
You mentioned it before, Drawdown Georgia is focused on climate solutions. As Drawdown was focused on solutions, Drawdown Georgia is also focused on climate solutions. But resiliency, as we've been talking about, is the face of climate change. It's the necessary, it's where we're at right now. And it's very, very important. So what does climate resiliency, we talked about it quite a bit, but if you want to expound on what does climate resiliency look like in different parts of Georgia? And what are you seeing? What are the ways in which you're seeing folks already respond?
I think the way I would answer that question is I would just ask your listeners or viewers to read that Georgia Resiliency Report, because it looks like different things in different places.
Sure.
Coastal Georgia, it looks like preparing for, cities like Tybee Island have developed sort of a sea level rise action plan. And that was groundbreaking in its own right. And those people, and I'm sure there are people on Tybee Island, might claim to not sort of be a part of the church of climate change, if there's such a thing, but they certainly know something's different about sea level rise and these king tides that are happening on the roadway between Savannah and Tybee Island. And so there was not a lot of pushback when stakeholders and policymakers decided to develop that resiliency or that sea level climate action plan. So that's what it looks like there. I think, in places like South Georgia in our ag belt, it might look like, understanding drought frequency and intensity, thinking about drought resistant seeding, thinking about more resilient infrastructure on those farms that can withstand winds that maybe when your family had that farm 2 generations ago, never expected to deal with 90 or 100 mile per hour winds that far into Georgia. But that's exactly what we saw with Hurricane Michael in the southwest part of the state. So that looks like sort of resiliency. I think it looks like, we're seeing some of this in municipalities updating our stormwater engineering, because we know that the stormwater engineering of 40, 50 years ago assumed that the rain then would fall like in 2026 like it does in 1970, and it doesn't. It falls much greater intensity. So we need to sort of rethink and reimagine our stormwater engineering system. This IRIS group that I mentioned at UGA thinks a lot about nature-based solutions or engineering with nature. For example, marshes, wetlands, and barrier islands are natural speed bumps for hurricanes. Right. We know that vegetation strategically placed in urban areas can provide evapotranspiration and cooling certain bodies of water. I've been involved with some work with the Ray, which is another sort of part of the Ray Anderson Foundation's ecosystem, where we have been working with the city of Atlanta, the University of Georgia, and the Ray to look at sort of alternative pavement surfaces, perhaps even rubber modified asphalt, as a more sustainable, resilient, climate friendly pavement surface. And in fact, the city of Atlanta just paved part of the Ellis Street corridor with some, and we're doing some evaluations to understand whether it has some of those benefits. So I think resiliency and planning looks like different things, but I think the key is we have to develop an appetite as a society for pre-planning as opposed to response after the fact.
Yes, we have to be proactive. It's so necessary. We talk a lot about equity on this show. In my work, have worked on racial equity and equity as it relates to climate and environmental justice throughout my almost 20 years in the work. In your perspective, how does resiliency and equity intersect? How do they intersect? What can communities do to center equity when they're planning resilience?
Well, what we know, and some of my own work has shown this, that there are certain communities that are going to bear a disproportionate brunt from these extreme events, whether it's heat, flooding, Helene, and so forth. We're all exposed to those events, but different communities will have varying degrees of sensitivity to those events and the ability to bounce back, the so-called adaptive capacity or resiliency. So, I think it's important that, communities, one, I think from the academic side, I've often talked about this, and I've published some work with one of my former graduate students, Mariano Fragamani, that you have to co-produce knowledge with communities. You can't come blazing in there with your academic credentials and tell communities this is what's going to happen to you. You have to sort of invest in those communities, engage, co-produce, and sustain yourself. So, in partnership with hopefully communities that are listening to this, will think about ways of developing community resiliency plans that sort of work for their communities and not just for the academics. I'm on the Sustainability Commission in Gwinnett County. I was appointed by Commissioner Jasper Watkins to serve on that commission. And there are things that we're already sort of thinking about and looking at and sort of, advising the commissioners on ways to increase resiliency and sustainability in the county. But the first thing is you got to start having those conversations. One of the first things, and shout out to the chairwoman, Nicole Love Hendrickson, and the commissioners, you stood up a sustainability commission. So in communities or in churches, stand up and, many of what many people refer to as our frontline communities or communities, marginalized communities. I don't like that word. Our churches, we have food pantries, and we have sort of social action committees and things in our churches and community groups and community centers. Think about having an environmental or a sustainability or a resiliency working group or committee in these organizations, these grassroots local organizations, and connect into what's happening at the city and state. And I will say that I think that Atlanta and the state of Georgia has demonstrated leadership in many of these areas. I mean, we're not where we need to be on everything, but we have Drawdown Georgia, and we have the Georgia Climate Project, and City of Atlanta has a sustainability officer and a resiliency officer. Shout out to Chandra Farley and John Siddell and those folks. And we have a thriving solar panel industry in Dalton, Georgia, and we have EV and battery plants throughout the state. One of the things that I often encourage the environmental and the climate community to do, and you mentioned this too, meet people where they are. You don't have to shove climate change down people's throat. You can look and see what they're trying to do. Right. And sometimes you have to be nuanced and savvy. I mean, you can't just ram what we think down. You got to approach it in a very subtle way and get the wins where you can get them. And so that's one of the things that I've tried to sort of propagate throughout much of my career.
I'm glad you said that, and I like the examples that you gave as well before about the different cities and what different cities are doing and the equity conversation. As I mentioned, I'm from New Jersey, so very different than Georgia, a very different place. But when we saw Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey years ago, I wasn't living in the state, but I try to keep up with what's going on at home. And that was where it hit on the coast, where the money is made and the money is spent, and more affluent coastal neighborhoods, they were propping up resiliency plans much quicker than they may have if that was kind of a more marginalized space. So when we're thinking about equity and resilience, those are the types of conversations that come to mind. Is like, what is, are we making sure that whether or not a place is making us money? We saw that with Hurricane Sandy for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we looked at Sandy, and a lot of people in Sandy, interestingly, we studied Sandy in one of my classes at University of Georgia. We had a graduate seminar, and so many people from Sandy died from what you had the sort of infrastructure losses, but just in terms of human losses from like what we call secondary impacts from like heart attacks and from carbon monoxide from poisoning from generators and so forth.
Right.
So, even just in communities, there's this sort of equity lens, but even just the sort of, education and literacy lens about well, if you use your power, don't put a generator in your garage and enclose. I mean, just sort of, communities may not sort of have this lens, and there are opportunities there. So I think there are multiple facets to sort of equity in terms of thinking about, preparation, education, and
Right.
part of the resiliency and adaptive capacity. There will need to be some economic investments made, and so that's where either policymakers, governments, foundations, or other entities will need to come into play.
Absolutely. This has been really eye-opening for me, really helpful for me. Thank you so much. And I know I speak for our audience when I say the same, and I really appreciate you coming to talk to us today. We'll have our last question now. It is my favorite question. What is giving you hope around climate in Georgia?
Well, I kind of alluded to it earlier. I mean, I think Georgia's been proactive. I mean, we didn't wait. And gratefully, we had a catalyst in the Ray C. Anderson Foundation that allowed us to stand up some vehicles like Georgia Climate Project and Drawdown Georgia. We have, a vibrant sort of climate and equity community. I mean, places people like South Face Partnership for Southern Equity, the city of Atlanta under Mayor Dickens and his team over there. The state is doing some things. Again, they might not be done in the way that we call them what they're called in climate spaces, but they're progressive on climate.
Yeah.
And then we have world-class universities and students and faculty and engaged people in the state at, the AU complex, Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, Emory. And then many of the other universities now are part of the Drawdown Georgia higher ed. And so that gives me hope that we have this vibrant community within the state. And then there's the Drawdown Georgia, I guess, business roundtable that Beryl Toge and her folks are involved with. So they're engaging the many Fortune 500 companies and presence here in the state. So, I think Georgia's showing that we're leading. Now, one thing that maybe disappoints me a little bit is we've created a blueprint here in the state of Georgia of how some things can be done. I would hope that some other states will start to kind of take some of that and run with it as well. I think a little of that is happening, but not at scale. I mean, there have been some federal headwinds lately in this space as well, but these things are cyclical, and we'll come out of that in some ways, and I imagine so. It really gives me hope that Georgia has been such a leader.
Thank you again, Dr. Shepherd, for joining us. Thank you for making the time. I know you're very busy for being on our little show here with the Georgia Climate Digest.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for joining us once again and for listening to our amazing leaders here in the state of Georgia that are doing fantastic work on climate. As Dr. Shepherd said, we have a wealth of leaders doing that work, and you are no different, Dr. Shepherd. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Shepherd, once again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.